Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. My name is Jane McAdam. I'm a Professor of Law here at UNSW, and I'm the Director of the Evacuations Research Hub at the Kaldor Centre. It's my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to this first panel session, where we're going to talk about how we foster conversations across divides. Before we begin, and particularly for those who might not have been here for the opening session, I just wanted to remind you about how you can engage in this conversation. You can pose questions through Slido. The information about how to do that is on the program. At the end of the session too, there'll be the opportunity for people to ask questions from the floor if they prefer. And I would also remind you that there's a reflections board, again, information in the program, as a means of posting longer comments or reflections. Just so you know, if I'm looking at my phone, I'm not bored and reading the news. I am going to be looking at the Slido questions, and I thought I'd better say that in case you think, what is she doing up there? So now to the main event. This session asks, how can we build a shared understanding about refugee protection in an era of polarisation? And how do we do this when misinformation and misconceptions cloud the conversation? Well, we are fortunate to have 4 experts with us who are going to tell us how we do this, offering their insights and expertise. So on the stage here, I'm joined by Sukhmani Khorana, who is a Scientia Associate Professor at UNSW School of Arts and Media, and she does research on media, migration and affect, and cultural diversity in the media. We also have Kylea Tink, an ambassador for the Community Independent Project and former independent federal member for the seat of North Sydney, which no longer exists. And then we have Saul Wodak, who is an advisor in the Behavioural Insights Team, and he's the co-author of a joint report with the Kaldor Centre on countering misinformation about refugees and migrants. And then joining us online, I can see her, but there we are. We're delighted to have Basma Alawi, who is the Deputy Executive Director at Community Sponsorship Hub USA and the founder of Weave Tales, an organisation that amplifies refugee storytelling and leadership to promote inclusion. Our esteemed panel will explore evidence-based strategies for fostering constructive public engagement on refugee and migration issues. They'll draw on insights from research, from policy and practice to tell us how we can start to build common ground across political and cultural divides, and how we can help to amplify refugee voices in shaping the conversations. This discussion will highlight what works to foster honest and respectful dialogue, which of course is what we hope this conference as a whole will do. So perhaps just to set the scene, I wanted to open with some questions about why. Why are we so divided about issues concerning refugees and migrants? And I thought I'd begin, Kylea, with you, because during your time in Parliament, you met with thousands of people, and I wondered from your experience whether you got the sense that there actually are these genuine divisions fracturing Australian society when it comes to migration and asylum, or do you see this principally as an issue of political opportunism?
That's a great question, Jane, and thank you so much for having me here today. This is a room of extraordinary individuals, so I want to start by saying thank you for the work that you already do in this space. It's not an understatement to say that I think you're among the best of us in this nation at the moment, so thank you very much. Reflecting on your question though, Jane, I think it is really interesting to think of my experience in that space as something that went over a 4-year period. And what I would suggest is it has actually significantly progressed over 4 years. I think it's not just here in Australia. Globally, you would all be very aware of the rise of the far right in countries that in the past we've looked to as being on par with us in terms of our experiences of democracy, you know, whether it's the UK, whether it's the Scandinavian states, Denmark, whether it's what we're seeing happening in the US. I think there is legitimately a rise of those far right mentality, which is we need to protect our own above and beyond anybody else. And I did see that in Canberra. I think there is no doubt there is political grandstanding. There are political point scoring that goes on in that building. But one of the things I would draw your attention to is the results of the 2025 election that has not long gone. We saw a collapse of support for the major parties. Neither of the major parties were really able to secure much more than 32% of the primary vote. So 1 in 3 people is kind of leaning back into traditional political structure. The community independent movement did very, very well. There were, 42 communities across the country that were ready to run, 37 did. And a lot of those seats, the community independent came as the second preferred candidate. But interestingly, and something that may have missed your radar, the other fastest growing vote across the country was One Nation. And I think in a room like this, that should concern us all, because we know that there is one of One Nation's key principles is that immigration is bad, despite the fact that many members of that party will have come from families that originally immigrated. In fact, most of them, let's face it, they're not First Nations people. So I do think it's real, and I think that is cause for concern for all of us. And I'm particularly interested in this conversation because I think media, and I mean this in its broadest possible sense, from traditional media channels down to social media channels, has an awful lot to answer for in this space, because it's conflating. Immigration has become this ubiquitous term for anybody seeking to move anywhere. And so the whole concept of what even is a refugee is almost completely lost in these calls for, we just want to stop immigration. And you only need to look at the streets of Melbourne last week to see that there is definitely community sentiment in this country. They want to stop immigration.
Thanks, Kylea. I mean, since you've mentioned media, I might actually turn to Sukhmani and ask, how do you think the media discourse about migrants and refugees contributes to the problem?
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on unceded Bidjigal lands, and also kind of take you back to the Children Overboard and Tampa saga, which as a young adult for me at the time was very formative in understanding and unpacking what was going on with refugee policy. And of course, we've had lots of iterations in Australia of treatment towards refugees, which has been less than just. But I think that has been really pivotal in shaping media discourse. And often when we talk about mis or disinformation, we think it's social media algorithms, it's fake news, it's AI bots producing deep fakes and videos. That is what we traditionally think of as disinformation or misinformation. But it started with that manufactured image in the Australian mediascape, which was not manufactured by the media, it was government sponsored. So I think we have to realize that a lot of mis and disinformation that we call, the way we call it now, the terminology actually originates in, some of it is state-sponsored, some of it starts with mainstream media, before we even racist stereotyping of immigrants and refugees. In the Australian case, primarily of refugees as illegal or irregular, despite so many fact sheets from so many different organizations, from academics, from legal experts, from media experts saying they're not illegal. We'll talk a bit more about why it is that it is very difficult to dispel that myth. But I just wanted to take you back to the fact that what we now know as mis and disinformation about immigration and refugees actually originated with government-sponsored disinformation and with a very long trajectory of racist stereotyping in the mainstream media.
I thought we'd bring in Basma here because you founded an organisation called Weave Tales to try and correct some of these misconceptions about refugees and migrants. I wondered what you see as driving these misconceptions. Is it the media? Is it the media plus other actors?
Thank you so much. So my name is Basma, and I just want to give you some background because my background is really not in research or data. I was an engineer in Iraq, became refugee in 2010. And when I first came to the US back then, I landed in a small community in Florida. I was focused on survival only, helping myself and my family, figuring out how to navigate a new life. I quickly noticed that people outside my immediate circle often misunderstood who refugees are. They ask questions like, why are you here? How did you get here? And it could really feel hostile. I learned early that responding with the stories, sharing a bit about my life, my journey, my hope, was not just a way to educate others. It was a way to stay safe, to survive at that time. Really, at that time, I did not know all the research on misconception about refugees. I just saw it work. And I saw that connecting personally with kindness could disarm fear and build understanding. And really figured out over time that much of the division we see comes from distance. Many people have never met a refugee. So their understanding is shaped by headlines, social media, or political narratives. But research over time have really confirmed what I experienced firsthand. Direct relationships are the biggest predictor of openness. People who know a refugee are twice as likely to support refugee resettlement. That's really what inspired me back then to create Refugee, a platform where refugees could share their own stories and our own voices safely and powerfully. But really over time, I realized refugees shouldn't have to carry that burden alone. The conversation shifts when long-time residents, welcomers, and sponsors also share why they welcome refugees, why they care, and how this relationship changed communities. So in short, I do work at Community Sponsorship Hub, and we have seen this in action. Sponsors from all political backgrounds come together to help families rebuild. One sponsor in the state of Ohio told us, we started out thinking we were helping a family start a new life, but they helped our own town come alive again. So stories like these show that mutual benefit of welcoming. It isn't one side, and it's now it's really how the division began to heal through a real relationship, not rhetoric. So what drives misconception about refugees? Distance, misinformation, and fear. But what can bridge that divide is connection, storytelling, and shared human experience. That same tools that really help me survive and thrive.
Thank you so much, Basma. I mean, you've just raised misinformation there as one of the problems, although thank you for offering the solutions as well. Saul, as I mentioned in the introduction, was one of the co-authors of a report with the Kaldor Centre about countering misinformation. Why is misinformation about refugees and migrants so sticky?
Yeah, that's a really great question. First of all, it's great to be here today. And so I work for a behavioural science research organisation. We had the privilege of working with the Kaldor Centre to do this really important piece of research. And what we wanted to do is understand and unpack this very question. What explains from a behavioural science and psychology point of view why misinformation causes harm, and then to try to use that knowledge to build practical solutions based on that evidence. So I'll answer that from a behavioural science, with a behavioural science lens. So I think there's a few main factors that explain misinformation stickiness. First comes back to Mohammed in his opening remarks. He talked a lot about the information environment, which I think he very eloquently explained some of the challenges that we're up against in terms of just the infinite number of volume of information out there. Very little of it's fact-checked. It's just flying around instantly, and it's also concentrating in certain echo chambers, and also we're having immensely influential influencers controlling some of that narrative who don't have necessarily the expertise to talk about these issues in a responsible way. So they're just some of the issues, but the information environment in which we're engaging with information about refugees and migrants and all sorts of other important issues is not setting us up for success. And then the other areas that I think are really important to think about is our psychology and our behavioural science and how we typically engage and process information. So there's a few behavioural science phenomena I've just mentioned. In the report, we name a whole, I think there's 6 or 7, but I'll just talk about 3 or 4. The first is that when we're in emotional states, it's called the hot states phenomena. When we're in an emotional state, then we're less likely to critically evaluate information in a dispassionate way. And so what the research shows is when people experience outrage, which we know that social media algorithms are reinforced to spread information which people respond to without emotion, then people the research shows that people tend to engage with that information and believe it without really reading it and share it without even engaging with it. Another important one is known as the messenger effect. So the person who communicates the message has a huge influence on how that message is received. So in social media, information is often passed down through communities, friendship groups, families, and so people already trust the person they're receiving the information from. So that's setting people up to just believe something on face value rather than actually critically evaluating it. Thirdly, another one that's really important is just the pure repetition. So when the research shows that if you just see a piece of information multiple times, you're much more likely to find it believable and credible. And just the pure volume of information out there, but purely because the algorithms reinforce false news. There's an amazing study that came out which showed that fake news spreads far more widely and fastly than the truth. And so just the pure repetition and the fact that these false news stories go viral mean that people see them multiple times and they already, by the 10th time, they're already sold. And a final one that's really important, and it's particularly relevant to this issue, is called confirmation bias. So we tend to bring up pre-existing values and stories into how we critically evaluate a piece of information. So when we view a new piece of information, if it conforms to our pre-existing worldviews, then we're much more likely to believe it and share it. And this is one of the reasons why corrections often fail. And I also think it's bringing it back to the issue about refugees and migrants. I think it's one of the reasons misinformation is so sticky about this issue. It's because it's so polemic and people have such strong opinions either way that when people see a story about, say, the housing crisis or something and people twist it to be about refugees and migrants, people are looking for an explanation to understand why they're suffering or why they're angry about this issue.
That's really helpful. And I want to kind of stick with this issue, but actually maybe turn now to, well, knowing all of this stuff, how do we then start to build bridges to kind of overcome some of this division? So, when we hear this misinformation, what should we do? I mean, how do we counter it as people in this room if we go out and someone says something that we know to be wrong?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and I'm sure we've all encountered misinformation in our private lives or online and thought, oh, what's the best thing to do? Do I engage? Do I let it pass? And if I do engage, what's the best way to do that? So in the report, we actually step out a practical decision tree with all sorts of different scenarios to help individuals or organisations decide on the best course of action based on the evidence. So if misinformation is already out there and you encounter it, I think the first decision you want to make is, do I want to actually respond or engage with it? Because sometimes it's not worth the effort, and sometimes it actually risks amplifying it further because of that mere exposure effect. The more times you repeat something, it just puts fuel in the fire. So the first question to ask whether you should engage is the misinformation prominent, proximate, and persuasive? So if it satisfies those 3 Ps, then you should engage. And if you do engage, we set out a formula. It's not our work, it's the work of John Cook, an academic in this space, that's called the fact, myth, fallacy, fact, FMFF, or other people know it more colloquially as the fact sandwich, because the facts are at the beginning and the end. So you want to start with a more compelling fact and tell a more compelling narrative. So say I mentioned the housing crisis before, that people might have seen misinformation about migrants contributing to the housing crisis. You might want to start with a more compelling fact, that is, all the experts agree that the major issue with housing is lack of supply, or insert relevant information or evidence that you see fit there. And we then want to we want to introduce the myth, which is the misinformation, but you have to be really careful in how you do this. And the best way to do it is to introduce it as a myth and also dilute it. So a good example here might be something like bad faith actors are spreading myths that migrants are contributing to the housing crisis. And we then want to explain what the fallacy is. So the fallacy is why. What's the logical error here? Or why is there bad evidence? And this is really important because this is part of education, and this teaches people how to recognise misinformation in the future in different scenarios. So for example, you might want to call out particular logical fallacies, like they're cherry-picking data or they're oversimplifying a matter. And there's a whole framework in our report that we point to. It's called the FLIC framework, and there's dozens of different type of logical fallacies that you can describe. And finally, you end with a fact. So the idea here is that the beginning and the end in behavioural science, it's called the primacy and recency effects. They're the most important piece of information because they're what people engage with and they're what people take away with them. So that's a bit complex. It's all in the report, but essentially that's a good formula. It's based on evidence, it's based on research, and it's shown to work. And I'll just add one thing to this, is that we talked a lot about, we heard a lot from Mohammed about the importance of facts and having agreed facts, but facts often aren't everything. We know that emotions are important, we know that values are important, and we know that identity is important. All sorts of other things are really important in terms of engaging people. So when deciding what fact to lead with, it's important to consider your audience and what are their values, what point of view are they coming from, because just coming at a fact without that understanding is not going to set you up for success.
Thank you, that's so helpful. And if people want to look at that report, it's available on the Kaldor Centre's website, or you can just Google terms from it, you'll find it. Sukhmani, I wanted to come to you, but perhaps take this in a slightly different direction. I wondered if you could talk about some of the ways that misinformation is increasingly targeting and then circulating within migrant communities, and factors that need to be taken into consideration in combating misinformation in these contexts.
Sure. So my colleagues, Dr. Fan Yang and I and a community partner conducted some research in 2023-2024 in Chinese and South Asian origin communities in Australia. The reason we decided to pick these communities is because of their growing critical mass. And also every time there was a federal election, some of us would be asked, which party is this community going to vote for? So we were really interested in understanding not which party they will vote for necessarily, but understanding the political and media literacy in these communities, which I think is the underlying kind of missing piece of the puzzle. And we had about nearly 200 survey respondents, as well as about 7 focus groups. And we really got into the nitty-gritty of what kind of media they consume, where are they encountering mis and disinformation, and also why is it being targeted at them and in what ways. And I do have to add that the limitation of the sample was that it was usually more politically engaged community members that responded to the survey and volunteered to be part of the focus groups, but they did talk a lot about their own communities, their own family networks, their own friends. And what we understood is that there are multilingual social media platforms which we don't even consider when we are thinking about social media algorithms, or we're considering the mainstream media. So a lot of these community members might be on apps like WhatsApp or WeChat, increasingly also the Red Book, and they are beyond the oversight of Australian regulators or even the social media algorithms. And often it is the disinformation campaigns are targeted within these multilingual platforms. Sometimes if it's not multilingual platforms, it might be more social media platforms that we are familiar with, like Facebook or X. They're also culturally informed disinformation campaigns. So it was interesting you mentioned, that talk to your audience. The disinformation campaign creators are also trying to talk to the audience. If there's an issue that is of particular relevance to the Vietnamese community in the US, then the campaign generators are often using those issues to create particular campaigns, say during the US federal election. Similarly, in Australia, we saw during the Voice referendum, there was a lot of talk about migrants being targeted with mis and disinformation about the fact that they might lose their land, which obviously has historical precedents, but it had particular relevance with these migrant communities because of the feelings that they had about how hard they'd worked in this country and how difficult it was to own their first piece of land and so on. So I do think that the cultural resonance as well as the platforms in migrant communities are quite relevant, which also then applies to how to counter this mis and disinformation, because often we found that it was usually younger members of these communities, sometimes women, who were doing it within their friends and family networks, and they found it to be very emotionally taxing work. So they were doing it without access to resources. So, the institutional level and the regulator level is very important, but these community experts, if you like, are doing it on a regular basis and also doing it in ways which is more easily understood by members of these communities.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think, we've already talked about what a polarised world we're living in at the moment, and as Daniel highlighted in his introduction, in any situation, some disagreement will always be, will exist. We're not saying you have to wipe out disagreement, but how do we disagree better, if you like? I mean, how do we stop talking past each other and start to have, like Mohammed was saying, where can we agree at least on the kind of basic premise that we're starting from? So Basma, sorry, I can see you up there. I can see you there, but I realise the camera's there. Basma, I was wondering if you could tell us, being in the US right now in the midst of this hyper-polarised political debate about refugees and migrants that President Trump is fueling, is it possible to maintain spaces for real dialogue?
It's difficult. It's very difficult, but not impossible. What I have learned is that dialogue doesn't begin with agreement. It does begin with trust, and trust begins when we allow ourselves to be open to hearing things we may not like without taking offense. And actually, I'm saying that I'm a sibling of 4, and I'm a middle child, so I learned from my own family how to navigate hard conversations. And really, too often, we retreat from conversation because we fear conflict or judgment. But real dialogue requires us to stay present, even in discomfort. In the US now, people are tired of being told what to believe. Yet, they are hungry for something tangible they can do. And I am very biased by community sponsorship, and I'm just going to say that I have done it myself early this year and gathered a big community around supporting one family. And that's why I believe community sponsorship provides exactly that, a space where people can act together around shared value, helping a family start over. It creates a bridge where conversation follow action, not the other way around. Sponsors come from all walks of life here. We have churches, universities, veteran groups, neighborhood circles across red state, blue states, and everywhere in between. Once they meet a refugee family, the framing changes. It's no longer about refugee policy or partisan debate. It's about real people, new neighbors, and shared humanity. We have found actually that the most powerful antidote to polarization is in debate. It's participation. When people welcome a family, they start seeing common ground in action, not just words. I love bringing sponsor stories, but one sponsors told me that after sponsoring a family, we started seeing each other differently, and they are like actually a group of sponsors in a church, and they had a lot of political debates. But after sponsoring a refugee family, they really came together, and he shared that we start laughing again. And that laughter, that shared humanity, is the essence of the dialogue. So as communities become more diverse, creating these spaces intentionally is very crucial. And dialogue isn't just in panels or meeting. It's best when it's done in potluck, in shared services and storytelling. It's really allowing people to encounter differences safely with curiosity and humility. And that's where empathy lives. That's how real understanding grows. And that's why even in hyper-polarized contests, dialogue is not only possible, it's very essential, especially in our time now.
Thank you, Basma, and that resonates so much with what Mohammed was saying this morning about that sort of difference between what's said at the national level and what's happening on the ground.
I also wish I can see Mohammed.
Yeah.
I don't see him now.
He's just
his,
here.
Opening remark. It was amazing.
And so what you said there about being the middle child and having to navigate the dynamics, someone else on the panel has been in a situation of very complex dynamics, and that's Kylea as a member of the Federal Parliamentary Crossbench. So, I mean, you've probably got more experience than most of us of working in contexts with a lot of competing interests. So I wondered, for you, what do you think works in forging a constructive path through disagreement?
Yeah, I mean, how amazing is the content that we've just had the opportunity to listen to? Can I just say my mind is racing at 1,000 miles an hour. And I think the challenge we have as human beings is we know what we know because we have incredibly smart people who find these pathways for us. But when you find yourself in that moment, in that environment, how do you suddenly recall that amazing model? You know, how do you go, right, I need to start with a fact, and then I need to do this, and then I need to do this, and I need to close with a fact. Look, it's fair to say, I think, the political environment, I assume in every country, I've only seen it from Australia, is like nothing you've ever experienced. You know, I think at the heart of it, here in Australia, federal politics is about two things, and those two things are power and control. Particularly when it comes to the two-party system that we have, they are totally geared to how can we exert power, which gives us control, and how do we make sure that we win the next election? Because once we win it, we get to do whatever we want to do, because we don't have a political system in this country that is built on trying to create an environment where we work towards consensus, you know, which I think is a kind of naive, opportunistic country girl. I thought that's what politics was meant to be about, you know, sending a whole group of different people to one building to have respectful conversations, to try and come up with the best ideas. Turns out I should have been sitting at a Kaldor Centre Conference, not in politics. But I think the thing I really took out of my time in politics and why I think the crossbench was so incredibly effective in the last parliament, we really were. We're the largest crossbench in the history of our democracy. And we were effective because we took a commitment to listening beyond anything else. So whatever conversation we entered, we would always start from the position of, let me listen to understand you, not just to respond, which might kind of inadvertently be leaning into that model that we've heard about. Because I think when I observe the way conversations are conducted in our community these days, it tends to be we spend a lot of time talking at each other. I've got something I want you to hear, so I'm just going to talk. And until you say, I agree, I'm just going to keep talking at you. I actually think we need to listen more. And in fact, I found that some of my most effective conversations were with some of the most aggressive people in this country in a political frame. And as long as I just sat there and listened really intently in a space trying to understand them and kind of kept coming back to, oh, okay, that's it, help me. Where does that come from? Okay, what data are you like, oh, I'm really interested in what you're having to say. And over time, the temperature would come down in the conversation. Because I do think, again, because of the kind of social digital environment we're living in at the moment, there's no space for grey. You're either with me or you're against me these days. And I think we're seeing that play out in the US. I'm terrified for the United States at the moment. And in fact, I just want to say the only thing that gives me hope is actually this growth of when at the highest level you're either with me or you're against me, what we need is our communities to say, no, we stand together. And I think that's why we see, what we've heard in these stories coming out of America. It's why we see what we're seeing in politics in Australia with the rise of the community independent movement. This is real people. It's people like you and me who are living in communities who are actually prepared to say, I'm not getting what I need anymore from that leader that I'm supposed to turn to, so I'm going to turn more to the people around me. And I want to engage and I want to build and I want to co-create with them. So I actually think, it's really important that, number one, we focus on building the community fabric around where we live. I think our communities have fractured. I grew up in a time without social media in a rural community where it didn't matter if you were the doctor's daughter or the Vietnamese, refugee, you all did the same things because you wanted your community to thrive. We've lost some of that because we've all got busy, we've all got big jobs, we all travel at 1,000 miles an hour. I think focusing back a bit on the communities in which we live, bringing people on the journey, but importantly, listening not to respond, listening to understand. Because once you understand, you give yourself half a chance of then entering a more constructive conversation with it. And, even just completely sidebar, I went shopping yesterday for groceries and at Harris Farm, and this woman in front of me was standing with her trolley, and there's automatic tellers and there's people going through the counters, right? And I just went, she wasn't using the automatic, and I said, are you going to use the automatic? She turned around and barked, I'm not using those things, those are jobs. You're putting people out of jobs if you use those things. They're just destroying our economy. Small businesses are collapsing. I'm standing behind her, oh yeah, no. Yeah, oh yeah, really good point. Really good. I know, jobs are really important, aren't they? Yeah, so you've come from a small, oh yeah, okay. And by the end of it, she turned to me and said, oh, well, why don't you go ahead with me? So actually, it's got nothing to do with refugee, but I just think that's the bit where people are starving. They just want to be heard. And I think if you can give people that chance to say, I'm here to actually listen to you. I may not agree with you. And in fact, most of the time you probably won't. That poor woman. But if you can listen, the power is in listening. And then using what you can pull out of that to share a story or move people along into your boat.
Yeah, I think often we talk about having, that right to speak, but it's actually that right to be heard and listened to that it's not just the talking, it's the understanding and building the bridge. Even if you don't agree, it's having then an open channel for communication. So what do behavioural insights tell us about what works in terms of effectively engaging in difficult conversations or in, contexts of division?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd first like to respond to the little micro question that came over here, which was, how do you remember these things in the moment? The truth is practice. And I remember when we were writing the report and I was looking at all the evidence, and then I'd hear our political leaders talk about these important issues of the day, and some would just absolutely butcher it. And they make all the mistakes. And they would start by, the first thing was as repeating and amplifying the falsehood. But then others had it, or before we'd even release the report, and these are not our ideas, these are, we just collated research that's already out there. But if you are someone who's speaking about important issues, there are some people that are well rehearsed and can deliver these formulas in a way that's evidence-based and really effective, and it really makes a difference. When you start to kind of understand and you look for these patterns, it's really interesting to hear what people are already doing. So
key message training for all of us.
Yeah. Read the report. The original question, which what does behavioural science talk about fostering agreement? So I can talk about behavioural science, but I can also talk about my experience growing up in a big family as a middle child, which I think equally qualifies me. I think that I probably won't say anything new because so much has been said already that I agree with and that I think the evidence agrees with. I think listening is really important, authentically listening to understand with curiosity, because everyone knows what it's like to say what you think and someone says immediately that you're wrong and here's 10 facts and then I have 10 facts and then we get nowhere. So I think first of all trying to understand where someone else is coming from, de-escalating and taking any emotion out, even if you're hearing something that you don't agree with, that angers you and is against every principle in your bone, heightened emotions will generally tend to escalate a conversation. That doesn't lead to a productive conversation. But I think if you can follow those 2 points, then you can get to a third point, which I think is the most important, but you can only do that if you set yourself up for success by showing genuine curiosity, is about those shared values. What are the things we can agree on? So on an issue like, I go back to housing, like, we all want a housing system that works, where there's housing that is affordable and available for people who need it. That's something we can all agree on. So how do we get there? And then we can explore that issue together. So research in behavioural sciences does this all the time. So it's called message framing experiments, where they'll take an issue and they'll try different kind of ways of framing it according to different values, and then they'll test it. There's various ways of testing it, and they'll find evidence and data on what frames work for different audiences. So an area that I'm really interested and passionate about is climate change. So you might think about what's the best way to frame climate change or renewable energy stories to different types of voters out there. So maybe left-wing people are interested in actually solving climate change, but maybe that's not great for everyone. So maybe issues that appeal to everyone are things like energy security, or future-proofing Australia's economy, or jobs, etc. But you can test these issues, and the data will determine what kind of things bring people together on an issue and converge audiences. So I think that's super important in terms of finding a way to move forward, is trying to find those things that you can agree on. And the last point that I'd say is sometimes you're not going to have a productive conversation, and that's okay. And sometimes just a starting point. So I'll come back to something again. I know everyone's referencing Muhammad, which is such a great talk. But we have this idea in behavioural science about the movable middle. So those people in the middle that are most likely to move one way or another, the undecided. So if you're talking to someone who's a fanatic on either side, or they either agree with you already, great. If they don't, then it's going to be very difficult to have any kind of true, authentic, great connection that you both have the possibility of changing each other's mind on. But I think so sometimes it's okay to just say, well, maybe we respect each other's differences and move on. And then other times you think, well, this is just the start of a future, conversation, and we can pick this up next time. So I think if you go in saying, I need to change your mind, that's the wrong attitude. It's, I need to understand your position and explore this issue.
Something that actually Saul just mentioned, because actually I think as a wider community we don't do it well in Australia, and that's let people change their mind, particularly in the media. If you see a leader come out and say, actually, I've changed my mind, we should be doing this, they get crucified. Suddenly they're flip-floppy, can't be relied on. So actually I think there's something really in that, like permission to change your mind should be something that we almost become champions of, and be open to it ourselves. I tell my children I've got all the answers, but maybe I don't. Maybe I need to change my mind.
That's right. I mean, that can be a sign of growth and maturity, to say, well, I thought this, and now I've read or heard or listened to all these other things, and I have a different view. Saul, I was just reading something this morning about, I think it was a very conservative guy in the United States who loved hunting, but he was convinced to buy an EV because it was much quieter and he could sneak up on animals. You find the common ground. Sukhmani, if I could come back to you. Often the kind of elephant in the room here is racism, when we're in debates about migration and asylum. So, how do we build bridges there when that's the context?
Wow, well, I have to be the older daughter in the room and bring up difficult conversations. So I think what we've heard from Saul and from Kylea as well about building bridges is really essential. But I also think sometimes we have to, once we've built bridges and built trust, not off the record, but once we've got to that point that there is some trust, I think it is important to raise the elephant in the room, which we also don't do well enough in Australia. So there are very few rooms where we can actually say the R word. And I do think we have to say the R word to get to the bottom of why we're having some of these conversations. And I find the behavioural insights really insightful and also resonate across very, very different areas, because some of us in disinformation studies realize that fact-checking alone is not going to work because there is something else at the heart of disinformation, and that is power. So it's not just there is a binary and this is fact and this is fiction. There is often all of these other variables like miscontextualized information, or information that is an advertorial, or information that is in a really appealing video. And it resonates with you because you already hold certain beliefs and values because of where you were brought up, or because of the school you went to, or because you've had certain experiences with friends. And I'm thinking of a certain far-right influencer in the UK who grew up in a certain part of the UK and formed certain opinions about Muslims as a result of that. So I'm just really, there are these real-life examples in front of us where people have become influenced by disinformation because of the underlying beliefs, and not just because it's it appeals to a certain kind of emotion in them. And that's where I think racism has to be addressed. There's lots of interest amongst people who do advocacy work in this area. We have a national anti-racism framework, which we're kind of, it's gathering dust, let's just put it that way. There is a multicultural review, which there is some implementation happening in Victoria, but I'm not sure there's much happening in the other states. But I think that's at the institutional level. A lot of what I'm interested in is also at the community level, which also came up in the wonderful keynote again today. And I'm thinking back to the start of the Albanese government and how much emphasis there was on the Home to Below campaign. Does anyone remember that? Yes, that was one of the points on which they distinguished themselves from the Morrison government, which is that the fact that they would enable temporary protection and then permanent protection for the Tamil family so that they could move back to Biluela. And that was enabled by a very successful campaign led by people in a rural town in Queensland. It wasn't led by some of us who are experts in various fields. And I think that's kind of the missing connection. We do have to talk about race, and we do also have to amplify those community narratives that have been successful.
I don't think Australians know what racism is. I actually honestly don't. I mean, I knew Giri really well when I was in Parliament. The work that the Human Rights Commission did to actually table that anti-racism framework was incredible, but it barely registered a ripple when it was brought into Parliament.
Well, it's not registering with the migrant community leaders either. And so I do think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to just educate everyone on that front.
And being okay in using the word. I know something comes to mind. There was a debate in Parliament at one point where the opposition, Liberal National Party, was trying to protest Palestinians being allowed into Australia following the conflict in Gaza. And anyway, the language that was being used was becoming racist. And so my colleague, Zali Steggall, stood up in the chamber and said in the chamber, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, but what is being said by that Member of Parliament is racist and it needs to stop. Now, interestingly, again, what she was calling out, I think, was completely appropriate because the way he was speaking was, by its very definition, racist. But the way the media picked it up was, MP Zali Steggall calls Peter Dutton a racist. And all of a sudden it was personalised. So I think there's this really interesting moment in our community to kind of say, how do we talk about racism? How do we help people understand what it is, what it feels like, what it looks like? Because at the moment, we spend so much time celebrating the fact that Australia is the most successful multicultural nation on the planet. Are we? I don't know. No, I think we have this underlying, and it's not just, my electorate was one of the largest Chinese Australian electorates in the country. It's not just white Australians that sometimes voice racist opinions, I think. And I think, so actually that's a really brave conversation for us to try and have in this nation, is what does it actually mean to be able to identify it, to hold yourself accountable and hold others when you see it, and speak about it in a way that, brings it to light and helps us move forward. Because until we can do that, we can't mature. as a nation. So, and that's maturity.
Absolutely, and I think that's why it has stayed the elephant in the room for so long, because having that conversation has been and is difficult. And I suppose that kind of brings me, not quite full circle, but to the last segment of the panel before we open up for questions, which is coming back to this idea of how do we build real world relational bridges to achieve progress on issues of refugees, asylum, migration, immigration, multiculturalism, all these things. And Basma, I just wanted to come back to you. I mean, you've touched on this a bit in your answers already, but I'm curious about what opportunities you see to connect across difference at the community level through the work you're doing in community sponsorship. And you've already touched on some fantastic examples of that. But how can we build on the lessons from those experiences?
Yeah, I think I am practicing today what Saul shared with us, repeating things over and over would resonate with people, and bringing back community sponsorship for the third time in my answers hopefully will resonate. And by the end of this session, people will look up. There is an organization in Australia, Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia, who's led by Lisa. Hopefully people will reach out and start looking at what sponsorship look like in Australia and how they can take action. But definitely it's really community sponsorship, in my view, one of the strongest bridge building tools we have here in the community. Just some data that could be helpful for people to hear about, but since the US launched sponsorship programs and gave us communities access to welcome in 2021, we have seen hundreds of thousands of sponsors across all 50 states plus DC. Actually, there are some studies that over 8,000 zip codes around the country have applied to welcome newcomers. And this includes volunteers from every political, racial, and religious background, and really showing the potential for connection across difference. I have shared before, when people come together to prepare home, find jobs, or help kids start school, they build something bigger than a service. They build belonging. And that's what really belonging goes both way. In places where communities worried about division or decline, sponsorship sparked renewal in some of the communities here in the US. Another example of a sponsor group in a small town in Indiana, a group of retirees sponsored a Congolese family. 2 years later, that family opened a small grocery store, and the local paper wrote they didn't just rebuild their lives here, they helped rebuild our main street. So really this demonstrates that connections happen not through messaging, but through shared responsibility and action. And there are so many data that CSH and other organizations really have put out that shows that behind every core group of 5 to 6 sponsors stands a broader network of 15 to 20 volunteers whose contribution are critical but often under-recognized. I just want to share with you, early in January of this year, I had the privilege of sponsoring a close family and with 4 other community members who are longtime friend. So we are a group of 5, welcomed the family in January. The family of 5 have a lot of medical and require a lot of support. We created a WhatsApp group, and every day a new person be added to and I don't know these individuals. Every day a new person is being added and wanting to support. And now we are now in October, 10 months, we are still very connected closely in communities. I don't know the way people voted. I don't know what their political background is, but we all agreed in Jacksonville, Florida, that we want to help this community, this family thrive. And this is our goal. And little by little, after 10 months, we get to know each other more. And we are actually preparing our Thanksgiving event together because we want to get to know each other more. So I really just want to emphasize that if it's not sponsorship, find a local community volunteer activity that you can do together before you even start talking about backgrounds and politics, and just find something that's unite you, work around it, and then you can have these really harder conversation later. Because as I shared in the beginning, trust comes first before these dialogue starts.
Thank you, Basma. And I think, what you've pointed to so powerfully there is something that for such a long time in Australia, our politicians didn't want us to have, and that is that connection with refugees, not allowing people other than those resettled to live in the community, and instead to be in detention or offshore was part of a policy designed not to enable those connections to emerge. And so I think, kind of coming back to the politics and without getting into the nitty-gritty of what parties did what, Kylea, I wanted to just ask you, we can find statements nonetheless of both major parties celebrating the positive contributions that refugees and migrants make and have made over a very long period of time to Australia, and yet we still do get regressive policies being pushed through the parliament. So how can principles that are apparently widely held in the Australian community actually win the day in the halls of power, where sometimes whatever it takes mentality still seems to prevail?
Yeah, look, what I'm about to say might be a little bit controversial, so I apologise in advance, and I do hope this is Chatham House rules.
Well, sorry, I might just say we are recording.
Yeah, okay.
I'll just jump in at this point.
Okay, g'day. So I think one of the most important things for us as a citizenry at the moment is to acknowledge that for a really long time, our policies in this space have been predicated on the basis that the major parties have told us there always had to be bipartisan agreement around whatever policy they were pursuing, because that made sense. Like, that was the way to ensure whatever policy was put in place would be maintained. So bipartisanship has been used, I think, in Australia to control this setting space for a really long time. The Billawilla family, I actually know them personally, and my heart breaks when I think of them, because actually I think they were used to, whatever the equivalent is of greenwash the Australian community, they were used by the Labor Party to convince us that Labor was going to have a different approach in government, and they don't, is the truth. All last Parliament, every time that was raised, we were told that the ALP could only do as much as the LNP or opposition would let them do, because they needed to ensure whatever laws they brought in, the LNP wouldn't immediately overturn in the next government. I'm here to say there is no way that the Liberal National Party is coming back to power in the next Parliament, in which case ALP does have a moment of, this utopian state. They will control our country for the next 2 terms of government. There is no excuse for the Labor Party, if they are true to their mandate on how they want to stand in the human rights space, to not be doing that work right now. So I actually think it is about those of us that have had any connection whatsoever with the government of this current point in time, not allowing them to continue to cast smoke screens at us and the rest of the Australian public, saying, oh, we can only move as far as the Liberal National Party will let us. That is bollocks. Now is the time for this reform to be done. If they do it now, they hold government for 2 terms, come 3 terms, even if another party ends up taking over, they're going to find it very difficult to walk that back. But actually, I think now it's time to see what the Labor Party is actually capable of doing and whether they can walk the talk. In the absence of them not being able to walk the talk, I do think it's time that people like us took our vote back. You're all very familiar with the term shit and shit light in terms of our 2 major parties. If shit light can't be better than we had hoped them to be, it's time to leave the shit completely out of the picture and go community independent at the next election. Take our voice and our vote back.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank the panel for, we're not closing by the way, but thank the panel for their incredible insights, and really open up the floor now, both here and online, for questions. bearing in mind what this panel has been about, if you do have a question about how we can best counter misinformation, how we build common ground, how we amplify the voices of refugees and migrants, of how we foster constructive, respectful dialogue, then I would warmly invite you to either put your question into Slido, and I already have some ready to go, or to raise your hand, and a microphone can be brought to you by one of our wonderful volunteers. Just a reminder that we are recording this, but of course if you would prefer that your question is ultimately not captured in the recording that we keep for posterity, please let one of the Kaldor Centre team know. As Daniel did in the first session, I'd like to request that you do keep your questions to 30 seconds or less, just so that we have the opportunity to hear from as many people as possible. And if you do have a longer comment to share or reflection, we have the reflections board, which you can access through the program. I'd also just like to remind everyone again too about our principles for engagement, so that we do have a respectful conversation. We each bring different perspectives to the table, and in the spirit of everything we've been discussing, we want to make sure that those are heard, listened to, and respected, and that people are treated with empathy and understanding. So I have got a couple of questions already on Slido, which I might go to first, particularly if people in the room want to think about what they might like to ask. And perhaps I could do this by synthesising a number of the questions that have come through Slido. And I'll frame those questions in this way. A lot of the advice that we've had today relates to interpersonal communication. How can we address more mass communication narratives? So, stuff coming through social media, these memes about mass migration, supremacist strategies, these kinds of things. How do we deal with those when we don't have necessarily that one-on-one engagement? Not sure who would like to.
I can just jump in. I'll give it just a short. I'd say maybe everyone else has been more about engaging one-on-one. Actually, our framework is more about when you have poise and are able to craft a message and think in advance about putting information out there. So the audience for our framework is more about community organisations, advocacy organisations, many people in the room, or people who are speaking with a pre-prepared answer. It isn't supposed to be a pocket formula for conversations, because then that just sounds like you're following a recipe book. But I do think that there's a number of other factors that come into play that are kind of outside the scope of our work, which are more long-term thinking about how to change the information environment, or change regulations, or look at long-term media literacy programs for our community. So, engaging with platforms to change how algorithms shape our social media environments, I think is really important. But that's long-term advocacy work that could really change the nature of how we engage with each other online and in different platforms.
Yeah, I have to say that in the work that I did, the research that we did, the interpersonal conversations were occurring because the institutional changes were not happening. So recently there have been changes with some social media companies, and whether they do fact-checking, I won't name them, you probably know which ones they are, and also changes in the ownership structure. So basically the kind of minimal regulation that you had of content which was considered to be harmful on social media is not taking place, or is barely taking place, which is why some of this harmful content is getting amplified. So we should definitely have that. The interpersonal conversations are also necessary, but one should not replace the other. I think we need both. There's also a number of kind of civil society-led programs where there's examples of organizations that are doing what they call data justice or tech justice. And they're forming these organizations because then they can lobby government or lobby social media companies to basically hold them accountable. So I think that kind of civil society, community level coming together of people putting pressure on government and also on the social media companies is extremely important, and we shouldn't just rely on interpersonal conversations.
I think there is a piece though in terms of the creation of content that is shareable. I think those who are working against our sentiment, our general sentiment, are very good at creating content that is snappy, is shareable, and it is voluminous. Like, they never stop. I think we pause often, and maybe I get that we need to, but perhaps that pause is too long in some circumstance. I do think, we need to be able to create content that is shareable, that is engaging, that is telling the stories that create those connections. I remember, I think it was last year, there was an amazing story done on a regional town down in the Victorian border area that has had mass immigration, and they've built a mung bean community. Is this ringing bells for anybody? Am I just making this up? Anyway, it's completely reinvigorated the economy. They got a run through the media. They made it international news. And all of a sudden there was this really positive sentiment about what impact it was having in regional rural communities. So I think content creation is something that as a sector, I think we could do better. Shareable content creation.
And just, I'll come to Basma and Saul, but actually it relates to a question, so I might throw it into the mix in case in your answers you want to respond to that. Because somebody has said, we've talked a lot about how you counter misinformation, but how do you do what you're saying, Kylie? How do we put accurate and more positive information out there? So Saul, you may want to respond to that.
I just wanted to kind of add to that,
Yeah.
yes, and I think we did a bit of research looking at what are bad faith actors doing, and a big piece of their playbook is about creating huge volumes where they're hitting the same nail on the head hundreds of times. So you look at the Voice campaign and the particular piece of misinformation that came out from both, let's call it our side's information, their side's misinformation. It's probably unfair. But the particular bits of misinformation that really carried on the no side were they were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of posts from different actors that said the same thing over and over and over again. And I'm not an expert in the advocacy space for refugees and migrants, but I don't know how coordinated the ecosystem of different actors are, and whether there could be work together more to go, what are our talking points and what can we all agree on, and how do we hit that nail from every actor all at the same time?
You don't even have to go as far back as the Voice referendum, and it sounds terrible to say as far back. You look at what's been happening in Australia in the last 3 months and the use of AI by these actors who seek to create division in our community. I mean, and they're doing that very well. They're presenting their messages as if it's being given by 1,000 different talking heads, but these people they're not even real people. These are AI-generated people that they're creating social media platforms, and they're just delivering that message again and again and again. So I do think, I've had this conversation recently about for bad messages to thrive, good people need to do nothing. And I actually think we've kind of done that sometimes. We haven't wanted to buy into it. We haven't wanted to amplify it. But I think we're hitting a pretty critical tipping point, not just here in Australia, but globally, where good people actually need to find ways to be united in amplifying those messages, positive messages.
Basma, did you want to come in on any of this? No?
No, I think just talking about stories and how we can really invest in storytelling. I do think there's not much investment in storytelling work that is happening, at least in the US, from where I am sitting, and not just investing in publishing stories, but in storytellers and in communities that their voice matter, providing trainings, tools, talking points, and prepare them, and not rush through, we have this event, come out and speak, or we have this media opportunity, and we throw people really have no clue about how to deal with media, how to answer hard questions, what to do. So we create our own bad narrative because we are not investing in the society that really need to uplift good stories from. So I really think investing in storytelling and in providing tools for communities is very important to make sure that we uplift the facts and the story together.
Thank you. All right, we'll now take some questions from the room. I'll take 2 or 3 at this point. Tamara, have you got the mic? Yeah, so we'll go to Leanne there. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for a fantastic panel. I have a call to action rather than a question. I hope you don't mind. I heard the frustrations about the National Anti-Racism Framework. I just wanted to say this Australian government asked for the Australian Human Rights Commission to develop a national anti-racism strategy and a framework. It was delivered to government 12 months ago, and the call to action is for everyone in this room, every time you speak to a member of government, please ask them when are they going to adopt or respond to that strategy. That's my call, please.
Great
Thank you.
Lisa, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to thank Basma for the shout out around the work that is happening in Australia for community sponsorship. And I want to, also a call to action, I guess. It's been really gratifying to sort of hear this conversation and have a spotlight on that work that sees it as more than just a program, and it's more than just about the settlement of a small group of people, and it is relatively small in Australia at the moment. It is about changing the narratives, about changing the public attitudes to refugees, and we cannot do it alone. We are an organisation that was born out of this sector. We need this sector to help us build a movement. It's not a program, it's a movement, and it needs constant replenishing and refreshing. We need to get out of the bubble of people who are already pro-refugee and break into our schools, our sporting communities, our universities, our workplaces. So if any of you have access to networks who are in that middle section that Mohammed was talking about, I'd love to work with you to see how we can get the message out to those communities. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got 2 calls for action, which is great. We've got lots of hands up. So maybe we'll go to questions now, because I think 2 calls for action and 2 questions would be great. So Tamara, is there somebody with a mic at the moment? Thank you. Apologies, I'm looking at people who are showing me who's got the microphone.
Thank you. It was a great, insightful contribution from all the panelists. And I would like to ask questions around with because we talk about community. I consider as community is the business actor are one of the main actors in the community, and I myself, as a new settlement person in Australia, and also I encountered several experiences. And so what I want to say is, refugees do not have power to control our narrative, and it's controlled by the media, and it's controlled by the power, who has the power and money and all these things. And also all this media is owned by the state sponsorship or either rich people. Talking about all the important of storytelling and also important of all this political framework and so on, but I haven't had a chance of hearing about the importance of the business sector that to talk about an opportunity of shaping the migrant refugee narrative, because we can see that all the business sector being employed by many refugee and migrants, and that are major tangible contribution to the society. I'm not sure how do all the panelists see that what are the potential opportunities that we can take on board the business actor to get along, because I also get engaged with the community sponsorship program too. So that's why I do believe that in order to do that, in order to be more comprehensive, I don't think that like this, people who care about refugee, not just about political person. I do believe that business actors are needed, and I would like to hear for that.
Thank you very much. That's a really important question, and I appreciate that. And yes, down here in the middle. Thank you. And then I'll bring these 2 questions back to the panel.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Very proud community refugee sponsorship member in the community. Quick call to action at lunchtime. If anyone wants to talk about how to do that, please come and chat to me. It's a fabulous experience. I want to ask how we can help CRESA through perhaps local governments, councils, to do basically what Basma's doing and get those stories out there. A lot of individuals in these groups are doing it off their own bat, getting the positive stories out there. We need something right at grassroots level using our councils.
Thank you. Okay, so back to the panel. Basma, we can start with you if you like to jump in, but if you wish to, otherwise I can go to the people in the room. Okay.
I think the question as it relates to the role of business in Australia in helping us build the case is a really good one. And I agree with your sentiment that they are largely overlooked at the moment. I think as I reflect on it, I'm actually mindful of the conversation that we're seeing coming out of the US at the moment, again, actually, where, we've seen the rhetoric that's come from Trump has set off panic through the tech sector. I don't know whether you guys are across this news, but the tech sector is now actually acknowledging that if Trump continues in the direction he's headed, they are going to lose access to a significant portion of the talent they currently rely on because people's visas are being threatened and people are being given, a moment's notice to get out of country. So I think rather than have an answer for you, I think what I'd like to say is I think you've raised a really important point, and I don't know that it is. I'm not aware of many businesses in this country talking about it. They've certainly never made representation to me on a large scale. I had small scale businesses would come and see me and ask me to work with them to help them get talent in or to tell the stories of the people that were working for them. But you've hit, I think, quite a magic spot in that maybe there is a whole sector that currently is not actively engaged in helping us build this case.
I think it was about a decade ago, internationally, there was quite a lot of leadership from corporates speaking out about these issues, but I think that has gone quiet in recent years.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Woolworths still runs a training program which is for refugee new arrivals, and there's many other organizations that do that if you look up on their website, but none of them are kind of advertising it or coming out at the moment in defense of refugees or even in defense of economic migrants at the moment, given what's happened in the last 3 months because of the political climate that we're in. So it's one of those moments where your positive food stories and economic productivity stories and business stories are not really doing a lot. But that doesn't mean that we should not have them. I do think that there is more scope, again, at the community level to have change. And one of my partners in an ARC linkage project is a local government council in southwestern Sydney in a project which is about employment and enterprise of newly arrived young migrant women. And I think what we've really realized is that a lot of this skills recognition is really slow for refugees in particular. I think it's a slightly different issue for economic migrants. And so I think starting with a strengths-based perspective, instead of just focusing on food or business or what's missing, again, if I think about how this could be a different narrative, it's not starting from what skills are they missing or they lack English language skills, but instead of doing that, reframing it as they are bilingual or some cases multilingual, and they're already bringing all of these skills and aspirations, social networks to this country, and how do we build on that? So that's one way that it could be reframed, I think.
And then just on the question around engaging councils more fully in the process of CRISPR and getting community sponsorship, keeping it really simple and maybe being a little bit cynical, what matters is votes. It matters at the council level, it matters at the state government level, it matters at the federal government level. If you want local councils to lean in around this, you need to prove to councillors that it will translate to votes for them. And always, I'm sorry for the cynicism, when it comes back to the current political frame, always try and frame what you're trying to do within the concept of them coming to you with a mindset of what's in it for me. What's in it for me to be talking to you right now? What is it? And that's very transactional. I'm getting right there. Don't get me wrong, there are big-hearted people who want to do good things in this country, but at the end of the day, they can only get there if they've got the votes. So how does what you're trying to do bring votes to the people that you're talking to?
Just before I take another round of questions, Basma, did you want to jump in at all on this or not?
No, I think the question, both questions are amazing. I think for the first one, there are, if we are talking about the US around businesses, there are so many great examples of state-specific policies that was established or even passed with the support of local businesses. And there are many publications around it. It's not enough. I agree. I actually always think that as more businesses could stand up for refugees and immigrants protection, but also welcoming, as we can get better in this work. So it's not enough, but it's happening. There are also some really great examples that maybe it's globally with tent partnership and how they are gathering businesses to hire refugees. And we have seen also another example when the first time the Afghan evacuation happened in 2021, we have seen so many, and also what's happened with Ukraine. When Ukrainians and Afghans came to the US, we have seen so many amazing businesses nationally stepped in, not just to hire, but also to donate, to support welcoming efforts. And I really wish that some of those also could come back now, again, to speak up and advocate, and similar to what was shared about the tech field, and how we can make sure we repeat this messaging over and over, that we need countries need refugees. It's not just we are doing it for good, but we do need in our communities refugees and immigrants for all of the good reason.
Thank you. I'll take another couple of questions. I've got one that I'm going to take from Slido, and then another from the room. So yes, down here. Oh, sorry, Tamara. We'll take these two because I pointed at you both at the same time.
Thank you. This has been a powerful discussion. I've got a question specific to Sukhmani, but anyone can answer. When we talk about the elephant in the room, and we approach it in the quietest way, like an EV, it challenged me that our discussion are at this level when the behavior start to show. But we haven't yet come to the level where we can actually germinate good behavior so that we grow a generation that is tolerant to others. How can we approach that from the grassroots?
Thank you. And directly behind you is a question as well. Oh, you've got a mic. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I think that misinformation, disinformation are sort of fancy terms to say that someone is lying, whether deliberately or not. And we have this beautiful concept of balanced journalism, where we have to offer different perspectives, right, on an issue from different parties, presenting their facts and views. And I think what has been happening, but what is happening more and more, is that we're actually balancing truth with lies. This means that misinformation is not spread just through some random social media post or AI or a robot. It's actually spread through our mainstream media. How do we address that?
Thank you. And perhaps I'll just take this question from Slido as well, which builds on this and I suppose opens up what we've been talking about as well. I mean, we've discussed how can business, local governments be engaged in this conversation. What other actors should be brought in? Because we do talk about this whole of society approach, but what does that actually look like? And how can we enable that? Who would like to start? You don't have to answer everything, but picking something, noting that we have 4 minutes left.
I'll be on the racism question very quickly. Again, we need a whole of society approach, but you're very right that it needs to start at the grassroots level. And the way we frame it shouldn't be a debate. I think one of the problems we have with the Australian media, which speaks to the mainstream media issue that you brought up, Valentina, as well, is that it's often, are we racist or are we not racist? When we haven't even discussed what race is, I'll tell you what race is. It's a social construct. So if we are constantly using other words like ethnicity or culturally and linguistically diverse, which have their merits. So I'm definitely not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But if you're not understanding race as a social construct, as something that changes over time in response to our political conditions, economic conditions, if you don't build on that basic understanding quite early on, we're constantly going to be talking about whether we are racist or not, or become defensive, whether we are a person of color or not. And so I do think to get out of that trap, we need to start early, so start really early in, I would say preschool, have those conversations at the community level, family level, of course, do it at universities. And as far as the mainstream media is concerned, I think this is really important as well and links back to that whole of society approach. We started doing cross-cultural competency with journalists, some journalists, but as long as the decision makers are going to always be people who don't understand racism or don't want to name racism, I think we've got a problem. So the mainstream media has a big role to play in unpacking, in providing context and doing things other than just descriptively reporting.
Yeah. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to have to keep each of you to a minute. I'm sorry, that doesn't do justice.
No, all I was going to say is I think that the media question is much larger and could have been a whole panel. And what I would share with you is a story. When I was in Parliament, I was part of the Parliamentary Joint Library Committee, and there was a proposal that the Parliamentary Library, which is one of the largest, should become a fact centre. So parliamentarians could check the facts before they speak. I want to share with you, in the context of discussing whether that should happen, 2 people in that room, each from one of the other major parties, told me that there's no such thing as a fact. Fact are subjectives. So a fact is subjective depending on where you come from and what. And my response was, is the earth flat? No, it's round. That's a fact. But I do actually think there is a whole unpacking of what constitutes a fact at the moment. And as to balanced journalism, you only have to look at the climate space to see, I think it comes back to trust. Fundamentally, as a species, we don't know who to trust anymore for information. So when somebody makes up something in the climate space, we don't know if we can trust science anymore. In the US, they can't trust medicine anymore. They can't trust clinical trials because they have a member of their government who's telling them vaccines, well, what is it? Panadol's causing autism.
Yeah.
Come on. So I think we're living in the age of misinformation, disinformation, and I don't think it's as simple as lying. I think that's what we were raised to believe, but it's not actually as simple as lying. They actually believe what they're telling you.
Thank you. Saul?
I'll jump on the media bandwagon and say I think what I'd like to see is journalistic standards based on evidence and reliable evidence about how misinformation causes harm and what could be done to prevent that harm. So I think about providing balance. If you've got 99% of climate scientists agree about climate change and 1% don't, then it's irresponsible to give a platform to that 1%.
50-50.
Yeah, I think that these are the sorts of questions that media organisations should be grappling with based on real evidence, solid evidence.
Thank you. And Basma, I'll give the final 30 seconds to you.
I think one thing that I will share in a really quick time around media, something I have done that I really wanted to do more, but there were in the news when the Ukrainians crisis were happening, the crisis in Ukraine were happening and the war, there were a reporter who reported that we should welcome Ukrainians. They are civilized refugees, not rather the other refugees who are uncivilized. And I got very triggered in it and wrote a very mad op-ed, but then I took it to some friends and mentors, and we really wrote it in a really good way to advise media on how to cover stories around refugees. And it's actually in the Newsweek. But then after that, our local, in Florida, local reporters in TV channels have picked the story, and they said, could you actually train our local reporters on ways that they can cover stories about refugees and immigrants in a more humanized way? And it was very, very great way to do it. And they gathered, I remember 150 reporters in different TV channels locally. And I was able to deliver to them like what to do and not to do when you are covering stories about refugees and crisis. And it's really amazing to see that there were a lot of things that they did not know or they were using in their language without being intentional about it. So how we can really make sure that we, community leaders, advocates, train reporters, train media on how best that they can cover stories around refugees, immigrants, and crisis. And maybe at the same time, we advocates have been going to Capitol Hill every year in DC and telling Congress members in educating them about the refugee work. Some pretend that they never heard before about it, and some really listen and they try to find ways to support. So we need just to continue to educate and train and find opportunities to continue to educate and train and repeat it over and over.
Thank you, Basma. And I think that's another call to action, but a positive way to end. It is a fact that lunch is downstairs. Yes. So I'm going to draw this panel to a close and invite you all to join us here at 1 o'clock for the next panel, which is called From Rhetoric to Reality, Centering the Meaningful Participation of Refugees. Thank you. Please thank our panel.